This is a reading of a document called The End of Moral Theatre. It's an exploration of morality, sovereignty, trauma, and truthful discourse. Nothing here is presented as doctrine, nothing here asks to be believed or adopted. If something in it is useful, let it be useful. If it isn't, let it pass. I'll begin now. The End of Moral Theatre, a treatise on sovereignty, trauma, and truthful discourse. Preface. This writing is not instruction, it is clearing. What is seen here is what has always been present when the noise falls away. The stage of morality. Human beings have long believed that morality requires performance. In every culture, ethical value has been expressed in displays meant to be seen, rituals of purity, piety, loyalty, obedience, or sacrifice. These displays did not arise from truth but from insecurity. Where sovereignty is not recognized as inherent, it must be claimed. Where it must be claimed, it becomes theatrical. Thus, moral behavior becomes something done for an audience. The audience may be divine, institutional, or communal. It doesn't matter. The presence of an observer transforms morality into a demonstration, not an actuality. Performance morality seeks recognition, not congruence. The individual does not act from the alignment of the self with reality, but from the desire to be perceived as aligned. This is the origin of moral theatre. It flourishes where self-worth is contingent, sovereignty is conditional, and identity is negotiated through comparison. In such environments, morality cannot be genuine. It is strategic. It is currency. The result is familiar posture. I must appear good, or I will be disqualified from belonging. The moral realm becomes a competition for purity, the purest thing being the one who appears least conflicted. This produces not moral development, but the suppression of complexity. Where complexity is suppressed, trauma accumulates. Where trauma accumulates without recognition, it converts into ideology. The performance becomes identity, and the actor forgets they are acting. The wound of the idol. Where sovereignty is not recognized as inherent, it is projected outward. The individual, unable to trust the self as the ground of value, seeks an external form to stabilize identity. This projection produces the idol, a person, figure, institution, tradition, belief, or symbol treated as the source of legitimacy. The idol is not revered because it is true, it is revered because it is needed. The need is psychological, not philosophical. It is the need to feel anchored in a world perceived as unstable. The idol serves one function: to hold the burden of certainty the self does not yet possess. But this arrangement has consequences. To elevate an idol is to divide the world into the holy, that which affirms identity, and the profane, that which threatens it. The sacred is not which is intrinsically valuable. The sacred is that which the self cannot afford to question. The profane is not what is intrinsically wrong. The profane is what exposes dependence. Thus, blasphemy is not the insult of the divine, it is the exposure of psychological dependency. The violent reaction to the profane is not moral outrage, it is the fear of collapse. The idol is fragile because it is not grounded in truth, it is grounded in avoidance. Where avoidance governs meaning, discourse becomes impossible. One cannot question the idol without destabilizing the self. Therefore, truth cannot be spoken, inquiry cannot be tolerated, and complexity cannot be acknowledged. The idol becomes a barrier to maturation. It prevents the individual from developing internal sovereignty. What appears to be devotion is often self-preservation. What appears to be faith is often fear of what would be seen if the symbol dissolved. This is why societies that elevate idols always produce their shadow, the obscene effigy, the grotesque reversal of the sacred. The profane is born from the attempt to preserve the holy. Wherever the untouchable is erected, the blasphemous will arise as its mirror. The idol and the effigy are a single psychological structure, one hiding dependence and the other revealing it. The structure dissolves only when sovereignty is recognized as intrinsic, not bestowed. The profane as the shadow of the holy. The sacred and the profane are not opposites, they are mutual dependencies, each sustaining the other. Where value is believed to originate outside the self, identity becomes conditional. Conditional identity must be defended. Defense requires the creation of threat. Thus, the profane is not discovered, it is manufactured. Its function is to destabilize the sacred. The more revered the idol, the more violently the profane must be rejected. This rejection is misinterpreted as morality. In reality, it is the refusal to confront the internal origin of one's insecurity. The obscene object, the accursed, the impure, the blasphemous, does not threaten the sacred. It threatens the illusion upon which the sacred rests. Therefore, culture that defines holiness through prohibition are unable to develop truth. Their moral systems are defensive, not generative. They preserve identity at the cost of perception. A morality based on sanctification and prohibition cannot encounter reality. It can only protect itself from it. This is the origin of dogma, taboo, censorship, and moral panic. The holy and profane collapse simultaneously when the need for external moral validation dissolves. When sovereignty is recognized as inherent, nothing needs to be elevated, and nothing needs to be condemned. The sacred returns to the world as that which is real. Platonic morality as a field. When morality is understood as rule, doctrine, or decree, it becomes an external authority. It exists outside the self, and the individual relates to it through compliance. Compliance requires surveillance. Where morality is external, society must monitor thought, supervise speech, regulate emotional expression, and suppress inquiry. Without this supervision, the external moral structure collapses. Thus, the policing of internal life appears not as control, but as protection of the good. This is how censorship is justified as safeguarding virtue, stigma is justified as preserving purity, and obedience is justified as alignment with the sacred. In such systems, questioning becomes dangerous, not because it is harmful, but because it reveals the conditions upon which the moral order depends. The unspoken truth is, if a belief requires protection from inquiry, it is already unstable. When the moral structure is externally maintained, speech ceases to be exploration, it becomes performance of correctness. The culture becomes organized around avoiding dissonance, repeating accepted formulations, and reinforcing conventional interpretations. This does not create understanding, it creates orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is not the presence of truth, it is the absence of permission to deviate. In such conditions, genuine curiosity is interpreted as subversion. Doubt is treated as disloyalty. Growth is treated as threat. The result is a morality that is static, brittle, and fragile. The system must continually suppress emerging perspectives to preserve the illusion of coherence. But a morality that must be protected cannot be true. Truth does not require defense. Sovereignty dissolves the need to police thought. When sovereignty is recognized as inherent, morality does not need enforcement, and identity does not require validation, questioning is not destabilizing, speech is not dangerous, disagreement is not war. Morality ceases to be a structure of control and becomes a field of orientation. A field requires no obedience, It does not compel behavior. It does not enforce uniformity. It does not manufacture purity. A field simply exists. One aligns with it to the degree one is able to perceive it. Platonic morality is not perspective. It is descriptive. Platonic morality is not prescriptive, it is descriptive. It does not tell one what to do, but reveals what is real. From this recognition, action emerges without coercion. Truth is not protected. Truth protects itself by being true. The end of moral comparison. Moral comparison arises where value is believed to be granted, earned, or proven. If sovereignty is inherent, there is no higher or lower ground to occupy. Comparison requires a hierarchy of legitimacy. Some beings positioned as more correct, others as less correct. This structure is not descriptive, it is compensatory. It exists to stabilize an unstable sense of self. The logic is simple. If worth is not intrinsic, it must be demonstrated. If it must be demonstrated, an audience is required. If an audience is required, identity becomes performance. Where identity is performance, comparison is unavoidable. The individual measures themselves against others to determine their standing. Superiority becomes the strategy to avoid inadequacy. Humility becomes a second strategy to avoid the accusation of superiority, but both are forms of self-reference, and neither is freedom. Comparison is always a symptom of unresolved dependency on external validation. When the ground of value is outside the self, one is always either approaching or failing it. This produces aspiration modeled as virtue, guilt modeled as moral development, shame modeled as accountability. But virtue that requires an observer is not virtue, and shame that does not lead to integration is simply a recursive wound. A morality rooted in comparison does not cultivate insight, it cultivates posture. One learns how to appear pure, righteous, compassionate, wise, and humble, but this appearance has no necessary relation to truth. Where comparison governs moral identity, sincerity becomes impossible. Every statement is measured for its effect, every emotion is evaluated for how it will be perceived. One speaks not to speak, but to be seen speaking correctly. That's a tongue twister. This is the perfection of moral theatre. When sovereignty is recognized. When value is no longer derived externally, comparison dissolves, performance becomes unnecessary, and identity returns to interior grounding. There is no need to be superior, there is no fear of being inferior, there is no effort to purify or display virtue. One does not become better, one becomes real. This shift does not produce uniformity, it produces difference without hierarchy. Differences in history, differences in temperament, differences in capacity, differences in understanding. But difference is no longer interpreted as deviation from an ideal, it is simply variation within being. Moral discourse, when freed from comparison, becomes a space of mutual clarification rather than judgment. When one does not attempt to convert, defend, impress, or correct, one inquires. Where inquiry is permitted, knowledge becomes alive. Trauma without identity. Trauma is not merely the event of harm. It is the transformation of the self in relation to the event. Trauma reorganizes expectation, perception, memory, and orientation to the world. But trauma does not need to become identity. Trauma becomes identity when the self does not have access to continuation, when the world offers no ground from which to move forward. Where sovereignty is not recognized as inherent, trauma becomes the proof of one's legitimacy. The harmed becomes the wronged becomes the morally justified becomes the one who must not be questioned. This identity is not healing, it is compensation. The wound becomes a form of authority. The pain becomes the foundation of the self. This is not survival, it is stasis. If identity is anchored in harm, any movement beyond the wound is experienced as self-betrayal. Thus, healing feels like erasure, growth feels like disloyalty to the past self, and continuation feels like surrender. The individual does not cling to trauma because they desire suffering. They cling because they do not yet trust there is a self beyond it. This is why trauma is so frequently sanctified, turned into a moral currency, used to justify behavior, used to avoid inquiry, and used to claim interpretive authority. The wound becomes the idol, and the wound demands protection. This produces the same structure as religious sanctity. What cannot be questioned must be preserved by force. What threatens the identity must be condemned as profane. Thus, trauma in identity creates the same logic as the holy and the blasphemous. The traumatized self is defended against the possibility of transformation. This does not heal the wound, it institutionalizes it. The return to continuation. Trauma integrates when the harm is recognized as real, no minimization, no narrative distortion. The self is not compelled to be defined by it, no moral elevation, no stigma. The individual is not forced to forgive nor to retain blame, no assigned narrative arc. The world does not demand the wound be made meaningful, no forced redemption story. Trauma does not resolve through punishment. Trauma resolves through sovereignty regained, the ability to act, choose, move, and continue from where one is. Continuation is not erasure. Continuation is not forgetting. Continuation is not denial. Continuation is the refusal to let the wound become the center of being. The self remains capable of future, not because the past is healed, but because the present is not owned by the past. Truthful discourse without threat. Truthful discourse is only possible where speech does not endanger identity. When the self depends on approval, correctness, purity, or moral standing, then every exchange becomes a negotiation for psychological survival. Speech becomes self-protection, self-presentation, self-justification, or self-defense. In such conditions, one does not listen, one waits for their turn to reassert themselves. Dialogue collapses into performance, persuasion, correction, or withdrawal. No understanding occurs. What is threatened in such discourse is never the argument. What is threatened is the self-concept that relies on the arguments for stability. To protect the idol, inquiry must be suppressed. To protect trauma identity, interpretation must be controlled. To protect moral hierarchy, disagreement must be stigmatized. This is why societies without inherent sovereignty must police speech, thought, and emotion. The moral system they depend on cannot survive contact with reality. When sovereignty is inherent, when the ground of value is not external, speech no longer functions as self-defense. When sovereignty is inherent. When the ground of value is not external, speech no longer functions as self-defense. Disagreement no longer threatens dignity, and correction is no longer humiliation. Conversation shifts from performance to exploration, and listening shifts from evaluation to reception. The point of discourse is no longer to win, to convert, to impress, or to secure identity. The point becomes to refine perception. Truth becomes something discovered in shared attention, not enforced by authority. One asks, what is actually so? What is present in experience? What remains when assumption is withdrawn? This inquiry is not fragile. This inquiry requires no consensus. This inquiry is not threatened by contradiction. Truth does not require agreement to remain true. When truth is not threatening. When being is not dependent on the correctness of one's position, one can allow their position to be undone. This is the threshold beyond which dialogue becomes generative. The self no longer seeks to defend, the self seeks to see. Inquiry becomes steady, simple, and direct. Meaning does not need to be asserted, it can be revealed. Conflict does not need to be resolved, it can be understood. Trauma does not need to be performed, it can be integrated. Morality does not need to be enforced, it can be recognized. Sovereignty does not need to be proven, it simply is. Conclusion. A morality that relies on purity, punishment, comparison, protection of idols, suppression of inquiry, or identity constructed from trauma cannot sustain truthful discourse and cannot resolve suffering. A morality that recognizes sovereignty as inherent, does not require obedience, does not fear contradiction, does not sanctify wounds, does not produce idols or effigies, and does not need to control thought. It does not repair the past, it allows the present to continue. This is the end of moral theatre. This is the return to the real.